Perfect. I apologize for this, but we've got a good group. Thank you so much. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties, but all right, we've got a good group. We're across the world. So I'll turn it over to Errol. You've seen his bio. To me, it's a great privilege. I met Errol via the Future podcast you did about selling Contagious, and it's one of the few pods I have saved on my phone, and I listen to it from time to time. And I've just found Errol to be a real inspiration. Amazing story. He's from South Africa. He's been in LA for about 50 years. He's also had Megadeth as a client, which is pretty amazing. So I thought we would just have a chat, and we're going to turn it over to Errol. Everybody knows the rules. You know, this is obviously conversational. We're recording this, but the idea is to obviously keep it within the circle. You know, kind of keep it as private as we can. You can say what you learned here, but not attribute who said what. But those are the general rules. But other than that, Errol, I'll turn it over to you, and you know, we'll chat until 2:45.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Firstly, it's a great privilege, everybody, to be with you this morning. I have spent the last 50 years of my life teaching. And I think somebody once said, if you can, you can, and if you can't, you teach. And I think that's a little bit unfair, but in order to make sure that that wasn't applied to me, I grew up, I went to USC. My undergrad is in accounting, my master's degree is in finance and management, and then I went to Harvard and studied negotiation with Urey and Fisher for a year. So if you cut me, I'm pretty much a consultant. I grew up at Arthur Andersen. I hated the accounting side, so I quickly ran over to the management side, and it was really an epiphany. And after spending about 7 years there, I decided to start my own accounting firm specializing in the music business. And we began to write software to help major rock and roll bands, because all touring in those days was done in cash, and artists were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we wrote some software in Lotus 1-2-3, if anybody remembers how far back that is, long before Excel was around. And then in 1992, I unfortunately developed a very serious bone cancer in my hands and had to undergo surgeries for about 4 years, which left me pretty much not able to use my hands. And so I sold my firm to my partners and decided that what's between my ears still works. And so I moved back to my first love, which is accounting, and then converted that to consulting. And I want to share with you that there are 3 people who've had a tremendous impact on my views on entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. And those people in no particular order are Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And after I read it, I wrote to him, and he invited me to come to Provo, Utah. And I spent a week with him, and I learned the underpinnings of the 7 habits. And I will share with you, everybody, that to this very day, I still use the 7 habits. I use it in my consulting, I use it in my teaching, and I use it just to basically solve general day-to-day problems. One of the people that I met in Utah was Edward de Bono. And Edward de Bono wrote a book called A Guide to Lateral Thinking. And when I read that book, that was my second epiphany. And I studied with Dr. de Bono for about 4 years. The book that you may have heard of is called The 6 Thinking Hats, which is a way of putting on different colored hats and then approaching a problem from what the hat represents. I would strongly urge you to read it. The third person who was most influential on me was, of course, Dr. Peter Drucker, and he taught at Claremont Graduate School, where I have taught. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Drucker on many, many occasions. sitting in the library as he held court and simply listening to his stories of when Jack Welch took over General Electric and came and spent 4 days with him. And his admonition to Jack was, be quiet for 3 days and just listen. And that's the famous story of how Jack came and took over General Electric. So those three people have influenced me very, very significantly. Wayne Dyer, who died unfortunately 3 years ago now, was someone else that I met at USC after he had written his first book called Your Erroneous Zones. And he became a mentor of mine. And the last book he wrote, The Power of Intention, has also had a significant influence on me. So I share with you these things because it's how I teach. I teach because I have been so fortunate to be mentored by some remarkable people. I was doing some research the other night, and I was shocked when I just looked at the number of companies that have gone in the last 10 years. These were household names. And I just want to read a few to you, not that they're going to be anything you haven't heard, but BB, 180 stores, Blockbuster, 1,700, Borders, 400 stores, Charlotte Russe, recently, 500, Dress Barn, 700, Fred's, Gymboree, The Limited, Sports Authority, Toys R Us, Wet Seal, and of course, most recently, Sears. And I thought to myself, there's got to be a reason why these companies are no longer in existence. And so I did some research on the life of US corporations. And what I found is something very interesting in a study from McKinsey. McKinsey said in the last 50 years, the life of the American corporation has dropped by 47%. That in point of fact, the average S&P 500 won't last more than 17 to 25 years. And I found that very interesting, and I began to wonder why. And I thought to myself, well, one of the things that has had an immense impact since 1992 was, of course, the internet. Because it was, if you will, the Gutenberg printing press of the 20th century. All of a sudden, people could now collaborate worldwide in an instant. And of course, as websites began to be more proliferated, we found an interesting correlation in the increase in entrepreneurship. It turns out that because people had this access to communicate with people worldwide, there had been a dramatic rise in entrepreneurship. I mean, what we've seen just in the last 2-3 years with gig workers, they have doubled. The number of gig workers has doubled in 3 years. According to McKinsey, that number will increase by another 25% over the next 2 to 4 years, as companies like DoorDash and others find that they can have people almost act as entrepreneurs, but at the end of the day, in point of fact, they really are employees. They're just not being called that. And I do believe that states are going to look at this with a very religious and a litigious eye, because the concept of an employee is based on the 1, 2, 3 test, the ABC test from the Internal Revenue. An employee is somebody who is under your control. And so the famous Borrello case is being tested in California. And in fact, one of my clients just lost a very large case with the state of California. So I think things are going to get very, very difficult for the gig working industry. Now, when it comes to entrepreneurship, I've taught now 6,800 students. And one of them was an illustrator, and he and his wife had an interesting idea. They were going to create videotapes on how to use the new software. when Illustrator came out and Quark and some of these pieces of software, they decided this is a good idea. And they came and asked me for advice. And I said, well, if you can sell the tapes, you could have a good business. Well, they started to sell them. And then, of course, something called the CD-ROM came along. And that changed everything, because now, instead of a videotape, which is a cumbersome thing, they could send out CDs for 68 cents a piece. Well, the two people who started that company, Bruce Wyman and his wife, Linda, they decided to name the company after his wife. And of course, the name of the company was lynda.com. And I consulted with them for many, many years. And I have good news, as you probably know. LinkedIn bought them about 3 years ago for $1.3 billion. On my advice, they took some cash, but a lot of stock. And then promptly, unfortunately, LinkedIn stock fell dramatically, as most of you remember. But the good news is, about 4 months later, a company in Redmond, Washington, by the name of Microsoft, came along and said, we'd like to buy you for a small sum of $29 billion. So I'm happy to say that at least one of my students at Art Center is in fact today a very successful billionaire from a very, very simple idea. So the reason that I want to talk about this idea is because it's based on a philosophy that I have. And the philosophy is based on a simple concept called a FANAFI, F-A-N-A-F-I. And let me explain it to you. And it's simple. Find a need and fill it. That's what entrepreneurship is. I don't know why we want to make it more complicated. When a man by the name of George de Mestral, a Swiss guy, used to walk his dog in Lausanne, and when he came back from a walk in the woods, those terrible little black things called cockleburs were all over his sheepdog. So he kept plucking them out. And one day his wife said to him, George, why don't you fix the problem? So he took the cocklebur and he looked at it under a microscope. And what did he find? A little black thing with hooks all over it that were grabbing onto the dog's hair. So he asked a friend of his whether he could create the cocklebur in plastic, which he did. And then he asked his wife for a piece of velvet. And he took his newfound cocklebur, made of plastic, and he put it against the against the velvet, and he pulled it apart, and he did it again. And then he realized that the word for velvet in French is velours, and the word to knit is crochet, and he put the two together, and George Mestral invented something called Velcro. He patented it, got 1/7 of a cent, and I presume that he's doing just about anything he wants. The reason that I'm so enamored with the concept of FANAFIs is because I tell my students to carry around a book and a pen with you at all times. And every time you run into a problem, the world is trying to tell you that there is an incredible solution. So Brian Chesky and his roommate were in San Francisco where they lived, and it was the Democratic Convention of 2008, and they didn't have money to pay rent. Didn't know what to do. So he said to his roommate, why don't we rent out our bedroom? We'll sleep in the living room. He said, but we don't even have a bed. So he said, well, let's run across to Big Five and buy 2 air mattresses. And you know where the story's going. They took the air mattresses, they blew them up, they went down to the convention center where there were no hotels, and they said, we have a room available for rent. It's $29 a night, and our company is a B&B, but you have to sleep on an air mattress, so we're going to call it Airbnb. Now, my friends, I don't know how it gets any more simple than that. All they did was find a need and fill it. And that's why I have been teaching the concept of FANAFIs for a long time. And when I use the word teach, I'm going to, if I may, if you allow me to differentiate between learning and teaching. I don't teach anything. I think anybody who believes they can teach, forgive me, is arrogant. What I much prefer to do is follow the words of Socrates, who said, my job is to create the desire to learn. And that's what I do. I do it in my consulting. I do it in my teaching. What I try to do is show students where opportunities lie and allow them to discern where learning takes place. And that, my friends, is what I call intrapreneurship. And here's my view. A lot of these companies that I spoke about earlier on are gone. And they're gone for very good reason. Because many of them stayed fixated to an old adage. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or this is the way we've always done it. You know, when a young man by the name of Jeffrey Bezos wanted to put Crown Books out of business, which was his stated objective, he created the Amazon bookstore. And all it did was put Crown Books out of business. But then he realized that he had solved a problem, not just for people who buy books, but in fact for people who buy anything. Because it's my humble opinion that Amazon is in the laziness business. You can sit in your home and you can buy just about anything. A book, a screw, a part for your car. And I noticed that he has now stepped down. He's become executive chairman. And he said something interesting, that the future of his company, Amazon, will not be in selling products, which Mr. Weiss will do, but it will be in technology. And that he is going to focus enormous amount of his assets on how to, obviously they currently make more money in providing cloud storage than anybody else, including IBM and others. But he is going to go beyond that, and they are going to spend an enormous amount of money on technology that will allow people to live their lives in a much easier way. In fact, with more quote unquote spare time to do things like be with family. I found that very interesting. When I began teaching, I was looking for a book that spoke about entrepreneurship. And I found lots of them, but I didn't find a single one that spoke to me until I had the good fortune of going to Paris to teach at INSEAD. INSEAD is the MBA school in both Paris and in Singapore. They're in Fontainebleau. And there I met two remarkable people by the name of Morbon and Chan. And Renee and Chan wrote a book called Blue Ocean Strategy. And I'm looking for head nods. I'm hoping to see some, because if, my friends, you have not availed yourself of this book, I can only but implore you, because the subtitle of Blue Ocean Strategy is How to Make Competition Irrelevant. Now, like most of you, I went to a business school where all we heard was competition. And the concept of competition creates a red ocean. It creates brand blurring, and it does not help a company differentiate. So when I read this book and I read the story of Guy Laliberté, who was simply a guy who was a piano accordion player, a stilt walker, and a juggler, and he performed in Montreal. And he found out that in Montreal, he had a lot of competition because other people were doing juggling and doing comedy. And so he went to them and said, why don't you go on at 9 and Michelle at 10 and Jack at 11 and Joe at 12 and Errol at 1 and Brendan at 2. And they started to perform this way, and all of a sudden, the audiences began to grow. Guy Laliberté realized he'd solved a problem. So he went to the Canadian government and he said he would like to create a circus, but it was a circus that in point of fact had absolutely no animals, and the circus would be outside in the sun. And the name of his circus obviously was Cirque du Soleil. Today, all these years later, they've grossed close to $70 billion. And what's interesting, Thomas, is they've had no competition. Nobody has tried to do what Guy Laliberté did. And one wonders why. And the answer is because I think what he did was he created something that was honestly so simple. And we spend so much time creating companies that have complex categories tied to them, and we forget about something called Occam's razor. Father Occam lived in around 1879, and he said the most elegant solution to a problem has the fewest number of steps and is the most simple. And so when I was thinking about that, I thought to myself, it's funny, I was having dinner and I had a knife and fork in my hand. The fork had 4 tines and the knife had serrated edges. And then I thought to myself, that's funny because 3 billion people in the world today eat with 2 little pieces of wood, chopsticks, which is the most elegant solution to an eating problem. And yet that kind of thinking, I think, has been absent from entrepreneurship. One of the things to me that is so interesting is what Google did. Google said to its employees, we will allow you to spend 20% of your week working on anything you want, provided it's got nothing to do with what Google does. What we do ask is that you give us first right of refusal to take whatever you've done and to perhaps create a company with it. Well, the results have been remarkable. Sony has followed suit. DreamWorks most recently has followed suit and has allowed many of its young animators access to the library, access to advanced education. And in fact, DreamWorks is now funding a lot of the movies that you see today on the various platforms that are available. So the question becomes, if you run a company, as many of you do, how can you stimulate intrapreneurship? And the answer is really quite simple. Inside your company, there are already people with an entrepreneurial spirit. If you pay attention to them and give them freedom and flexibility, using Google's 20% rule, if you empower them to know that if they work on something that you have both the capital resources and the management experience to assist them in succeeding, more importantly, when you recruit, look at the people you're recruiting and think about whether or not they have an entrepreneurial spirit. Ask them the kind of questions that will easily be answered. You need to commit to having an incubation center in the company. You say, Errol, well, this will require an investment. It may require an investment, but I can assure you that Gmail was created from one of those 20% rules. And of course, so was YouTube. So at the end of the day, Google has benefited immeasurably. Number 5 is to applaud and reward the people. If they come up with something, then, make sure you reward them in a way that's very tangible. And lastly, and most importantly, please, my friends, it's critical that you provide mentorship for them, because without mentorship, it really is almost impossible for young entrepreneurs to be able to succeed. The last thing I would like to say, and then I'd like to have conversations with you, is the last thing I remember learning from Dr. Drucker before he passed away was something he said that I found quite stunning. He said to the group, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the American corporation is on the decline, and social entrepreneurship is going to be on the incline, because social entrepreneurship does something critical. What it does is it acts as a change agent for society that allows people to seize opportunities that are missed by other people. He said these social entrepreneurships will work in social, in cultural, and in environmental places. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of a company called Mondragon. Mondragon is a company in Spain, and it is a collective. It is owned by the workers. Yes, it sounds very much like socialism, and in fact it is. But let me give you the numbers. Last year, Mondragon grossed $81 billion. Mondragon today owns 124 companies, does research for 6 of the largest pharmaceuticals, for Oracle, for Microsoft, for the biggest companies in the world, and it is managed by 12 people who are elected every 3 years. The people who work for Mondragon have free university, free schooling for their children. Medicine and hospitalization is completely free. And people are paid. And those who are exemplary performers receive some bonuses. So if you have never looked at Mondragon, please, my friends, please take a look at it, because after spending 50 years in a classroom, I have seen dramatic changes in students. Today, the millennials that I teach are so vastly different than the people I taught 30 years ago, and they are revolutionarily different than the people I taught 50 years ago. These millennials do not want to work for a company for the next 15 to 20 years. I was consulting last year with a company called Loot Crate. I don't know if you've heard of them, but Inc. magazine referred to them as the fastest growing company in America. And they were. And they sold paraphernalia and t-shirts from movies. So they went from nothing to 600,000 members. And because they did not apply the rules of management that all of us accept and apply, I read last week that they have filed for bankruptcy, owing over $150 million, including $15 million to the sales tax board of the state of California. And the sad thing is that there was no intrapreneurship allowed in this company. They were very much, forgive the term, a frat boy mentality. They were all from CGU. They had all graduated from the Claremont Graduate School of Management. But I thought to myself, what an incredible shame to build something so profound and then to not bring in the kinds of people who could have helped them grow the company. The same way that Bezos, the same way that other great companies have brought in people. My rule of thumb, if you've got an entrepreneurial activity and it's growing, hire your CEO and make sure that he or she is way smarter than you. Because if you do that, you're going to make sure that the management team, just as Eric Schmidt has brought remarkable growth to Google, we need to do the same thing. But I am still fixated on this idea that intrapreneurship will continue to grow for the next 10 to 20 years. I'm only going to teach another 3 semesters because it will be the celebration of my 50th anniversary. And I'm going to stop teaching for another reason. And it's something I'd like to share with you as we close. I was lecturing and I said something about, well, Kimosabi, that makes great sense. And the students looked at me as if I was speaking Swahili. And I said, do you know what I'm talking about? And they said, Absolutely not. I said, do you know who the Lone Ranger is? And they said, no. And then a student said to me, Professor, may I ask you a question? I said, sure. She said, you graduated in 1971. You didn't have a cell phone. You didn't have the internet, and you didn't have a calculator. How on God's earth could you possibly have graduated college? You know, Joe, it's a funny thing. It seemed to me that these young people today, these millennials, have become so addicted to the digital tools that I worry that if these digital tools were somehow not available for a few hours, I wonder what would happen to them. I know what entrepreneurs would do. An entrepreneur would take a source and a resource and put them together to find a solution. So with that, I know I have gone in 15 different directions, but I will tell you that somebody asked me, what are the two things you are most proud of? And I will share with you, they are my children, my son and my daughter, and the fact that I have had the opportunity of touching the lives of over 6,500 kids. And I do it for one reason and one reason only, because in some way I got to touch the future. I'm 76, so I have so many breaths left, and I'm not going to waste any of them because I still have a great deal to learn. And meeting Mark and meeting people like you and having a chance to share my ideas is a complete joy for me. So thank you so much. And if you have some questions or some ideas that you'd like to share with me, I'm an eager learner. So thank you.
Errol, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Does anybody have a question? I mean, I have a few, but anybody, just turn off your mute button and ask away. What a shy audience. Well, Errol, or Joe, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, a question from really where you started, Errol, with your sort of main influences. The 7 Habits was fundamentally kind of life-changing for me, kind of reading that and suddenly going, oh, right, yes, this is what I've not understood about life so far. Do you have any? I sometimes find that those kind of books, from that period, the sort of 80s and stuff like that, they're a little bit frowned upon. They're seen as a little bit passé now, and a little bit like, oh God, it's like, oh, it's all cliche and it's old-fashioned. Do you have any kind of thoughts around that?
Joe, thank you for asking what I think is a very, very important question. When I talk about books to students, I get a glazed over look. So I asked this semester students, I have 30 of them, how many of you have read a book in the last month? And I think, Joe, you already know the answer. The answer was 0. So I asked how many had read a book in the last 6 months. And they said they'd leafed through some design books because I teach at a place called the Art Center College of Design, which is the most famous design school in the world. Most of the cars on the road today were designed at Art Center. So I asked, no, a real book. Who's read a real book in the last year? And Michelle, the answer was 0. And when I asked why, they said, I have Audible. I have the internet. And I then, of course, asked the presumptive question, which is, how many of you read a newspaper? And they actually laughed at me. They said, Professor, why would you read a newspaper? And I said, well, if you want to find me on a Sunday, you'll find me in Valencia. You'll find me at the Starbucks. You'll find the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and Business Week on my table. And if nobody comes to talk to me, I'm the happiest guy in the world. So I guess, Joe, my only answer is that sometimes I feel like I'm an anachronism. But I'll tell you, for me, I just got a book this week called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is my 5th time reading it. I just bought it again. And I will tell you, Joe, that book, when I read it, and I don't use this, what I'm about to say, very often, but that book changed my life. Because, Joe, it was the first day in my life that I realized some days you're the pigeon and other days you're the statue, but you have a choice as to how you respond. In 1992, I spent 4 years in casts, both arms. So that means, forgive me, going to the toilet and buttoning a shirt are impossible. And somebody said to me, "What a terrible thing that's happened to you." And I said, "Really? I see it completely differently." Because what I did, Joe, was I stopped taking my hands for granted, and I started realizing that the greatest asset I have is between my ears. And if I can just listen to people and listen to what their issues are and share with them what I hear, then I can be of value to people. So Viktor Frankl's book, which I will now read for the 5th time, really was a game changer. And when I speak about books, I'll tell you something interesting. Students tell me, "Professor, you know, I bought that book you talk about, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I can't put it down." And for me, Jack, honestly, that's the greatest joy in the world, to hear that somebody still reads. You know, when I remember the years that I spent in the stacks at the library at USC, because it was the only place I had, I remember those days with great joy. So I'm still a bookie. I don't have Audible. It's not my thing, sorry. And I think books will still be around long after the internet has perhaps lessened its addiction on people. Or put it this way, it's what I pray for. By the way, I want to share with you, when I read out loud. I know it's annoying to some people, but I learned that from Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln, when he read a book, he read out loud, because it goes in your eyes, into your brain, and in your ears, so you're getting it from 2 sources. And I can tell you that my comprehension by reading out loud is absolutely phenomenally different. Give it a try. I think you will enjoy it. You may annoy somebody, but, you know, do it in a quiet spot.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
You know, they say if there are no questions, it can be one of 2 things. You were very good or you were very bad. So at this point, I'm kind of nervous as to which it is.
Well, hey, I have a question. This is Eric. Can everybody hear me?
Hi, Eric.
Yeah.
Eric,
Hello.
how you doing?
Great. Yeah, thanks. This has been really interesting to listen to. I was curious to hear your thoughts on navigating the people challenges of implementing intrapreneurship. And I'm really, on board and enjoy a lot of the ideas you're talking about, and then putting them into practice. I find more and more is about solving people problems as much or more than solving actual, like the tangible, whatever, like that is the underlying issue. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. That's really an excellent question, because the idea of entrepreneurship is not new. In the old days, we used to call it by a strange name, the suggestion box. And then the suggestion box, in fact, was stuff put into a box from entrepreneurs. And the trouble is, it wasn't taken seriously. So what I have done with my consulting clients is I've instituted a digital box where people put ideas in. And what I ask the CEO to do, all of the consulting work I do, I ask that my clients do a monthly town hall meeting with most of their people, if not all of them. And that town hall meeting, firstly, gets everybody on the same page, number 1. Number 2, it enhances transparency. Number 3, it shows that you trust the people you work with. And number 4, it gives people an opportunity, especially when you say, we had a problem this week. I was wondering if any of you have any ideas. It is a way, Eric, of saying to people, I trust you, I value you, and I want to take what you have between your ears and turn it into a solution for our company. So it's all about encouragement. You know, the sad part about Loot Crate is that when I told them they should have monthly town hall meetings, the answer was absolutely not. These people are paid to do what they do, and they ran the company basically without management by walking around. See, when you ask me, what do I tell my clients when I do CEO coaching? I tell them management by walking around. Why? Because that's how you're going to find that you can catch people doing something right. You know, Eric, CEOs, leaders have a choice. You can kick somebody in his ass or you can pat him on his back. It's only a foot away. And it's all about understanding people. So oftentimes when there's a young entrepreneur, they let me mentor that person and I make them take the Myers-Briggs test. And when the person says, wait a sec, I've heard the Myers-Briggs, that's a personality test. No, it's not. It's a type indicator. It's based on Jung's work on personality, and it's going to tell me how you process information. And I will share with you that I've been doing this using the Myers-Briggs for at least 40 years. At least 40 years. And there isn't once that it hasn't been of value. Somebody just said goodbye and books to read. Man's Search for Meaning, no question. Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is next to my bed. Thank you, Dr. Peter Drucker. Your Erroneous Zones, the first book that Wayne Dyer wrote, The Power of Intention. And then 2 books from 2 professors that I studied with at Harvard, William Ury and Roger Fisher. And these books are phenomenal. One is called Getting Past No, and the other is called Getting to Yes. And it taught me how to negotiate. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. It absolutely a brilliant read. The other book that is going to sound strange is a book I started reading as a graduate student, and it's called The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jack, for nodding your head. It makes me feel good. Jack, it taught me strategy, and it taught me to understand the concept of power, and that power comes from not exerting power. And so I'm so grateful for my professor it was a sociology class. He turned me onto Sun Tzu's work. And I'm Jewish by faith, but I read as much Buddhism as I do Judaism. And so I've called myself a Buddhist Jew. And that's how my thinking has been impacted in the last 20 years. I study the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a remarkable Buddhist monk he runs an incredible place called the Plum Garden in France. And on my bucket list, and I have one, is to go and spend a week with Thich. That would be for me. And I see, Joe, you're nodding your head, so you know the story of wash the dishes to wash the dishes. You know, my students refer to my class as business church. And I like that. I think that's a compliment, because part of me is a traditional MBA, raised the same way as many of you, but part of me is a person who lives in his heart. And so much of my teaching comes from my head, but much of my philosophy comes from my heart. And I think those two are really a wonderful synergy to each other. And my students seem to agree.
Hey, Errol, we'll finish up with one question here from Eric Gomez. Eric, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You have the final question. So,
all right, I'll bring it home. Errol, first of all, thanks for doing this. You are a hero, and so I'm glad that you posted this opportunity to be able to spend time with you. The question is in the age of electronics and digital media, how can people still be creative in getting others' attention? Like you referenced in a podcast I listened that you had your resume cut on a bigger piece of paper so that it stand out, stuff like that. How can people get back to the basics?
Eric, thank you. I'm going to say something that may shock you. I believe, Eric, you've asked an existential question, and I don't mean that hyperbolically. I will tell you, Eric, that I am deeply concerned, and I do mean that in the strongest sense of the word, in the fact that this generation has become addicted to digital media. And I think at some point in the very near future, we have something like 180 diets in America to help people lose weight, which is stupid because if you want to lose weight, just eat less. There's the book, it's free. But I think, Eric and Thomas, we've got to put young people on a diet of cutting back their usage of digital media, because I will say this, I believe it's dangerous. And by the way, that's not my opinion. If you do the research, just listen to Brene Brown's latest protestations on this. If we don't begin to limit our use of digital media, I believe that it's going to hinder and hamper our ability to think. And the other thing that worries me is that this addiction to digital media is almost creating agoraphobia. I mean, I watched students in the cafeteria before the COVID started, and they were texting. So typical me, I walked up to the table, sat down and said, "Hi guys, who are you texting?" And the answer, Michelle, was each other. And I went, oh my God, you are sitting at a table and you are texting each other. Why don't you talk to each other? Oh, I don't know. The question that Eric has asked is an existential question. I don't want to get political, but I will simply say that what happened on the 6th day a month ago was as much to do with the improper abuse of social media than anything else. Because today, everybody has an opinion, and because those opinions aren't vetted, people take that what is on the internet as the God's gospel truth. And that's what scares me the most. As an educator who spent better part of 50 years, I'm very, very hopeful that we will see a decline in the use of digital media, or we will see parents like my son and daughter-in-law who limit strictly the time that my 4 grandchildren can spend. When grandpa goes to the house, the iPods are put away and the iPhones are gone, or grandpa's gone. And I mean that seriously. I'm there to be with you. I'm there to tell you stories because I'm a storyteller. And I'm there because I love you. I'm not there to watch you play some idiotic game. Even though it's Minecraft and I know it's a good game, you do it when I'm gone. But when you're with grandpa, or when we go out for dinner, please God, when this pandemic is over, there are no iPods, there are no iPads, there's no cell phones. It's communication. It's what we thrive on. It's how we nurture each other. If we don't talk to each other, thank God for people like Mark for putting together this wonderful group of people. I also, every Sunday, am part of Saturday, I'm part of a group called Metal. And Metal is a group of 300 men and women who simply get together to converse. And I spend 4 hours every Saturday. And I can share with you, it's the most joyous time for me. And if you look it up on Mighty Networks, you will see METAL. It's absolutely remarkable. and the friendships that I've made are quite astonishing. I'm a people person. I love people. You know, that's why I came to America. I left South Africa at the age of 21 after being arrested for the second time and being beaten for the 10th time because I hated apartheid, because a third of my family was exterminated in Nazi Germany, and I knew I couldn't live there. So I came to America. Why? Because I knew it was a place of freedom. And I was right. It's the best decision I ever made in my life, because it is the only place I've ever lived where I am free to do whatever I want, where the word meritocracy still means something.
Errol, thank you so much. That was great. It was a real honor. I'm so pleased we connected. I hope we stay in touch. Hopefully I'll see you in California. If people want to reach out to you, can I share your email? Are you cool with that? Or how?
With the greatest of pleasure. That
Okay,
nothing
perfect.
pleases me more than to begin to have a dialogue with all these wonderful people that are part of it.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much. You are a true legend, and thanks for making the time. And maybe next time we can hear about the Sunset Strip in the 80s.
Oh, that would be a fun thing. And Joe, I am a Manchester boy, so yes, I'm a Manchester City boy. If you cut me, I bleed blue. So thank you, everybody. God bless and stay safe. And this Sunday, I get my second COVID vaccination, thank God. And I hope for all of you that it will be very soon that you will get yours. And my greatest joy, Mark, will be perhaps one day for all of us to find a way to get together personally and share some thoughts.
That would be great. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Earl.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Mark.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.